Okie doke. Good afternoon, everyone. Just someone give me a wave if you can hear me, because I haven't been able to check with anyone. Lovely, you can hear me. Beautiful. Okay, so good afternoon. My name is Lee. You may have seen one of my videos before, but I'm Operations Manager for ASD Helping Hands. And I thought I would just chip in with a little talk of my own to finish the day off. And I want to talk to you about challenge behaviour. It's not so much challenge behaviours, but de-escalation techniques. It says in the classroom in the title, but these can be applied anywhere, wherever you are. So a little background of myself. I've worked with Helping Hands now for 6 years as operations manager, so managing a volunteer team, but also delivering services to those with autism and their families. And I'm sure many of you have come across me in your travels through the autism world. Before that, I worked with Autism Anglia as a family support worker for 2 years, providing support to families around behaviours, education, lots and lots of different things. Personally, I've got 2 brothers who have got autism, Mac and Ryan, and they couldn't be more opposite each other. They're polar opposites. My stepdad, we believe, has Asperger's syndrome. That hasn't been diagnosed. He doesn't want a diagnosis either, so we leave it at that. And then closer to home, I've got Ben, who you may have met through one of the previous talks. Ben has ADHD, he's 33, and mental health illnesses as well. And we've got a special guardianship of a young lad called Liam, who is 16, with ADHD and behavioural difficulties as well. So bear with me 1 second, ladies and gents. I'm sort of coordinating all of this behind the scenes. No idea. Just deal with that for me. So, right, my attention's completely on you now. So yeah, so I've got, at home, we've got Ben, who's 33, ADHD, mental health conditions, and then Liam, who we've got under a special guardianship, who is 16, ADHD with behavioural issues. Not so much now, but when he first came to live with us 4 years ago, he was a handful, shall we say. I'll put it that way. So I've only got 45 minutes and I tend to rattle on quite a bit. So I'll just get straight into it. What I will do is I'm quite happy to answer questions throughout. So if you have any, feel free to pop them in the chat box. I've got it up on my screen and we'll go through it like that. So challenge behaviours and de-escalation. Oh no, ignore that slide. So before we look at how to de-escalate, we have to understand what it is and why we use it. So de-escalation techniques, they go against what we tend to do as caregivers. When a child is upset, anxious, worried, as people that care and people that love that child, we want to go in and comfort them. We want to tell them, you know, everything's going to be okay. We want to give them kisses and cuddles. We want to help them solve the issues, solve the problems. De-escalation techniques go against all of that. To de-escalate someone effectively, you need to stand back from the situation. You need to evaluate the situation and be calm and be neutral. Because when someone is escalating in a behaviour, they're moving up what I call their anger mountain or their emotion mountain. And the idea, as you move up, you become more and more stressed. And as our stress levels rise, certain chemicals in our bodies, such as adrenaline, cortisol, endorphins, begin to release. When our body has an influx of those chemicals, it sends it to our brain to deal with. Now, the part of the brain it shuts down is what we call our prefrontal or our neocortex. Now, that section of our brain is responsible for things such as our communication, our reasoning, our logical thinking. There's 2 other sections of the brain, one called the limbic system and one called the reptilian brain. The limbic system is responsible for our feelings and our emotions, and the reptilian brain is responsible for our instincts, our fight and flight, and our impulsive behaviour. So as those chemicals are going around the body, as they're being passed up to the brain to deal with, the brain begins to shut down our ability to communicate, our ability to rationalise, and our ability to think logically. Yep, our prefrontal cortex, probably the bit we need at the most. And from that, our emotions come through, our instincts come through, which is why a lot of behaviors end up looking like they are angry, because that is the default emotion technically from our brain and our instinct. So Melissa just asked a question. Do you have any advice on how to speak with other children in the group class about behaviors from their sender classmates, particularly young children under 7? Yeah, I'll answer that quickly for you. The best thing to do is let them lead the conversation. So if you've got a very young group of children, 5, 6, 7, let them lead the conversation. Perhaps try an activity around behavior. What's appropriate behavior? Why some behavior isn't appropriate and why some people may show it. There's a series of books called Can I Tell You About? And they are written for children, and they're about lots of different conditions. So can I tell you about autism? Can I tell you about ADHD? Can I tell you about PDA? All available on Amazon or anywhere else you get your books from, I must say that. And they explain it in a child-friendly way, and it's quite easy for them to relate to it. Alternatively, there's a series of books called All Dogs Have ADHD or All Cats Have Asperger's Syndrome. I see a few nodding heads, so I think some of you may have come across them. And they're very nice, very accessible books. So it is about using those resources, using things that they can relate to. I'm just making sure I'm going to answer your question, Melissa. I haven't just rattled on about something completely different. During the group class about behaviors. Yeah, I would suggest using those books and then talk about maybe why they do them. So all behavior is communication. So it's about that young person trying to communicate with their classmates. And it's about being kind, you know, being thoughtful and working things around that. So hopefully that's answered your question for you, Melissa. So some key things to think about when we are de-escalating. It's remaining calm and professionally detached, but it's not natural. Even as a parent, de-escalating your own child, you need to remain calm in a professional manner and you need to detach from the situation. There's something called pacing that we'll talk about in a bit more later on that links into that. And it is about a whole different mind shift. Like I said right at the beginning, caregivers want to go in, they want to offer kisses, cuddles, they want to offer solutions to problems. And that only feeds the fire. Yeah, you're giving the brain far too much information to process because that prefrontal cortex has shut down. So you're basically fueling a fire, chucking petrol onto a barbecue. I'll give you an example of this. Liam was due to start City College due to start City College in September. We went up for his induction, you know, the enrollment, and they told him there and then that there weren't any places left on the course. They had all been allocated. So of course that made Liam begin to escalate in his behaviour. He couldn't understand why they had asked him to come in if there were no courses available or no places on the course available, and he'd really got his hopes up. So all of a sudden his world was sort of shattered. Yeah, he didn't know what he was doing come September. So when we got in the car and when we were driving back, because I'm quite a solution-focused person and I like to problem solve, I started offering lots of other solutions. So I said, City College isn't the only place they do this course. You could go to College of West Anglia, or there are different types of provisions, or you could try doing this course for a year and then come out. And it wasn't until he told me to, in more words, shut up, I'll leave you to your imagination to work out the rest, that I realised what I was doing was giving him options and giving him solutions that he couldn't process at that point. We had the same conversation in the evening and it went a lot better, and he's now in College of West Anglia doing his level 1 carpentry course and he's quite happy. So what I was doing at that point is I wasn't de-escalating, I was actually escalating Liam, which is what we want to stay away from. So reasoning with an angry child or young person isn't possible because that prefrontal cortex is shut down. We've discussed that. So what our aim is during de-escalation is to reduce the level of agitation, reduce their frustration, their anxiety, so that we can have a meaningful conversation about it. And what we're going to do is we're going to explore how we go about that. Excuse me. So it's very important to understand that we cannot control what happens in the world. We've got no control of anything that happens around us, nothing at all. But what we can control is how we respond to it and how we address issues. Yeah, so it's very important to remember that. So when we look at escalation, there's 7 steps to it, 7 stages. So if we start at the bottom, we can be calm. So when a student or a child is calm, you know, they can access their learning, they can reason, they can interact with their classmates, interact with adults quite but quite happily. The issue comes when there becomes a trigger. Now that trigger might be apparent, it might not be apparent, but I can guarantee you there is always a trigger for behaviour. It may be locked under something else. It could be from a previous time during the day or week, but there will always be a trigger to behaviour to start that escalation. As they begin to escalate, they become more and more agitated. And because they get agitated and frustrated, that only accelerates the process. And what they do here is they then tend to focus everything onto that situation or to that trigger that's began their agitation. And that then turns into a vicious cycle. So I don't know if you've ever been stressed or someone has really ticked you off, but when that happens, you then tend to focus directly on that situation, directly on that thing, and you find yourself working yourself up even more. I have done over the past few months, obviously with the COVID-19 situation. There's several things come through, especially from the government. I'm not a great fan of the government at this point in time, but the more I hear and the more I focus on it, the quicker I build up in my agitation, and the quicker I get frustrated, the more quicker I get angry. So once that's all happened, they've gone through that cycle, they then hit their peak. Yeah, they then have their outburst, they then have their meltdown, they then have their heightened emotional state. I prefer emotional state because it can encompass a lot more. Once that's happened, they then go into a phase of self-de-escalation. So naturally, as humans, we will de-escalate ourselves. Yeah, this could be your young child or your young person might like some quiet time in a sensory den, or they might enjoy doing some vestibular activities such as trampolining, punching a bag, running around like a headless chicken, if you excuse the phrase. But it's all ways of de-escalating. And then they enter a phase of recovery. In this phase of recovery, they begin to be able to reflect on what's happened, begin to able to reflect on their behaviour and the whole situation. So actually in the recovery phase is where a lot of the healing and a lot of the reflection comes. Now, typically, someone at their peak, say you or I, someone without a neurological disorder, will tend to go for about 12 to 18 minutes. That's how long the brain takes to process it. When a young person begins to de-escalate, it can take a normal person around about 60 minutes for the body to completely reset itself before you go into that recovery phase. But if someone is to interject while you're trying to self de-escalate, all they do is push you back to number 5. They push you back up to that peak. Yeah, which is why when a young person has had an outburst or an emotional heightened emotional state, they become much more susceptible to going back into one, because we haven't allowed them time to enter that recovery phase and begin to heal themselves, begin to process things. Now, for a typical person, again, that would take around 60 minutes to maybe 120, so an hour to 2 hours to fully calm down, to fully de-escalate. Someone with a neurodiversity, neurological disorder, for example, it could take anywhere up to 24 hours, if not longer, because of the delay in that process. And when I'm talking to schools, they often try to do the restorative work or the recovery work within sort of half an hour of an incident happening. And that's not going to work. It's a recipe for disaster because that young person hasn't fully calmed down. Worked with a young lad once. His safe space was a compost bin at school. Not the most suitable place to go and, calm down, but that's where he chose. The school decided that that wasn't appropriate. So what they decided to do was, when he went to this compost bin, they would remove him physically if needed, and put him in a room they deemed appropriate. Now, this did happen. So he went to his compost bin. He was removed by several male staff members, put into the pastoral support worker's office. She then tried to do restorative work with him. So she gave him a pen and paper, asked him to draw how he was feeling. And I'm not saying this is the correct behaviour he displayed, but he ended up physically assaulting her because he was still at the top of his mountain. He was still up there. It was, everything that was going on was still at the forefront. So what they should have done, hindsight's a brilliant thing, but what they should have done is address the behaviour possibly the following day or later on that day, depending on the child. And they would have had a much better response and a much better outcome to it. But of course, we want to de-escalate a child, and we never want a child to reach their peak, to reach the top of their anger mountain. So to de-escalate, we need to think of things, we need to do it before they reach that point. We need to notice the triggers, we need to notice the signs. And the earlier we can do it, the easier it is. So de-escalation techniques are most successful when used early, before that child's become physically or verbally aggressive. Yeah. So to do this, sorry, I've lost all words today. To do this, we need to spot the early signs of agitation and what they could be that lead to escalation. Now, some of you are probably aware of these. Some of these are quite common, quite normal. So we've got things like frowning or grimacing. So facial expressions. A child could begin to cry or look physically upset or look like they're about to cry. For a lot of our young people, they begin to curse. So typically a child that doesn't use curse words may begin to, because that's how they begin to express how they're feeling. Clenching fists is a typical one. Because they're beginning to escalate, because that build-up of adrenaline is going into their body, they're getting ready for that fight or flight response. Yeah, and typically it is a fight response for a lot of young children we work with. So clenching fists is a sign of aggression, and it's a sign of frustration. So that's a key one to look out for. Stomping around. Part of a way to self-de-escalate is to let out frustration and let out anger and those negative feelings. Not negative feelings, because no feeling is negative, but to let out those feelings. So stomping around, physical activity can help sometimes. Large motions with arms. So I don't know if you've seen any comedy programs where someone gets angry, but a typically angry person will start to flail their arms around and big exaggerated movements. Yeah. So start looking out for those things if they don't typically do them or use them. It's a way of clearing space around you. And deterring any threats. When when you meet a bear, I don't think many of us have met a bear, but they say when you come face to face with a wild animal, you have to make yourself look as big as possible. Yeah, you have to make yourself look as scary as possible. So that's what they're doing with their arms. They're trying to make themselves look less approachable. Expressionless. So although a child may be escalating to the point of physical or verbal aggression, they can also go the other way to what we call a shutdown, a sensory shutdown, or a withdrawal phase. So you have to be careful of the two. So they could become expressionless. They could look like they're tired. Just nothing there. Yelling is a typical one, along with the cursing. Once again, it's about making yourself look big, making yourself look scary. So earlier I did mention something called pacing, and I think it's quite important. So that situation I gave with Liam to do with college, I was very bad at my pacing in that. So pacing is a cycle of feeding off someone else's emotions and escalating. So you're dealing with someone who is angry, is upset, is frustrated. They shout at you. What we then do is we become defensive. We then shout back, or we then become aggressive back to them. I'm not saying aggressive as in, assault them or physically punch them, but our tone of voice, our manner, because we feel threatened. And what it does is when you become angry at them, when you start showing that kind of frustration, it validates their feelings, it validates how they're acting. And they then do the same back to you. Now, if you then do the same back to them, you can see where we're going here. And you just end up with two very, very angry, very hostile people whose both prefrontal cortexes are shut down, because although it happens to autistic children and those with neurodiversities, it can also happen to you or I. It's a biological reason that happens. So yeah, you then get to a phase of feeding off of each other, and you begin to escalate each other, which is why we need to remain calm and detached from the situation. So we may not always know what you may not always know what you're going to do, but you need to keep in your head what you're not going to do. So it's mostly about mind frame. So if you are in a situation where you have to de-escalate a child, you need to keep in your head that I'm not going to get angry. I'm not going to raise my voice. I'm going to keep my distance. I'm going to speak calmly. I'm going to use simple sentences or simple words or phrases. It's much easier to keep in your head what you're not going to do, and then you begin to be able to regulate yourself. And what we normally find is when the child has least control, it's time for the teacher or the person to have more control over them themselves. So what I mean by that is that that young person has lost all control of their logical thinking, of their rational brain. So it's our job as caregivers, teachers, parents, carers, whatever capacity you may be in, you have to control them, not in a nasty way, but you have to manage their emotions. You have to manage their thought patterns. And pacing is a lot of something we see in homes, where the parents obviously very frustrated, very tired, and they bite, and then the child bites back, and it just keeps going and going and going at that point. So you have to say to yourself, right, I'm going to step away from this situation. So that's a bit about what de-escalation is, what happens in the brain when behavior is going on. Just give a bit of background. So now we're going to talk about some actual techniques we can use. Okay, two types of techniques, non-verbal and verbal techniques. So our biggest one we can use is remain calm in a situation. You might not feel calm on the inside. You might feel like you're going to burst, but it is about what you portray outwards. So if you can remain calm, relaxed shoulders, relaxed face, open hands, all of those, it begins to transfer across that child. It begins to allow them to see how they should behave, how they should address the situation. And as I put here, it can be just as contagious as fear. So, if you're watching a horror film or you go to a scare maze or on a roller coaster, for example, and someone says, oh, I'm quite scared, or oh, I'm quite anxious about that situation, it passes around the group. So it's the same with that calm feeling. If you remain calm, it transfers onto that child. So it's important to remember that only 7% of what we communicate with a young person is through the words we say. Yep, so the actual words we use is only 7% of our communication. 38% of our communication is through our tone of voice, how we say it, the speed we say it, whether we raise our voice, lower our voice at points. The other 55%, so over half of what we say, is communicated through our physiology. So communicated through our body language, our gestures, our facial expressions. And it's very important to acknowledge that, remember that, because typically what you say doesn't have an effect. It's how you say it and how you act around that young person or around that child. And with autism being a communication deficit, they will struggle to understand a lot of what you're saying. Things like social communication, social interaction, they struggle to understand body language, struggle to understand gestures. So if you think you've taken away 55% of your communication, you have to over-exaggerate it. So you have to look like you're remaining calm. I'm repeating myself now, so I'll carry on. Yeah, so I covered my next point. So it's about modeling that behavior. Yeah, children with autism learn through imitation. They learn through looking at their environment, how others act, how others are portraying things. So they will model the behavior that you outwardly show. So just some tips for you for non-verbal communication. So appear calm, self-assured. You might not know what you're going to do. You might not know what's going to happen on around you, but you have to remain in a calm, self-assured way, like you've got control of a situation. You know what is going to happen. Maintain a neutral facial expression. So like I said in the previous slide, children with autism and indeed young people and adults with autism struggle to understand facial expressions. So if you're trying to communicate and trying to get a point across using your facial expressions, it's more information they've got to process, more difficult information they've got to process. And what happens when an escalating child's given more information to process? You're feeding the fire, you're keeping them at their peak. Okay? Allow space. So you haven't got to be close to a child. You can stand back, make sure they're in sight, make sure you can see them, make sure they're safe, but give them the space they need to calm down and they need to regulate themselves. And to do all that, you control your breathing. So naturally, as adrenaline, cortisol, endorphins build up in our body, our respiratory rate heightens. You know, if you're ever in a situation you find anxious, a situation you find scary, you'll tend to see your heartbeat will increase naturally, like mine was this morning at 9:30 before I put all this live. So if you're able to control your breathing, you know, in for 6, out for 7, or however you choose to do it, it can help a lot in those 3 previous things. So that's the first thing to consider is your non-verbal techniques. When it comes to our verbal techniques, it's about keeping a lower voice and keep an even tone. Men are typically better at de-escalating a child with autism or neurodiversity than a lady. Because biologically, when a lady becomes stressed, she becomes anxious, her voice will begin to rise. Now, a high-pitched voice or a higher-pitched voice is more difficult for the brain to process and understand. So especially for ladies, it's about keeping that lower tone voice if you can, or keep an even tone. Okay? And distractions and diversions are extremely useful. So the amount of, I was speaking to, actually, I did a day's course on de-escalation and techniques with someone, and it was a teacher, and he was trying to de-escalate this young lad, and he couldn't work out how to do it. And he mentioned his socks, because this kid had odd socks on. And it was such a change from what's going on that child had to stop, engage the prefrontal cortex, so that thinking communication brain, and then reply. So it is about using, you know, distractions, diversions. If they've got a special interest that you're aware of, maybe direct them onto an activity around that. So correct use of phrases. As someone's behavior increases, you need to bring your communication down. So with correct use of phrases, it could be going down to either 1 or 2 very simple words. So stop or come. It allows the brain to process that easier. Or it may be that you have to start using visuals. So some of you may be aware of PECs, but any visual could be objects of reference, so physical objects. So for example, a glass. Although this is a gin glass, it has just got water in. So about using things you've got to hand and pitching that to that level of the child. De-escalation scripts, we'll look at one in a minute a bit further, and acknowledgement. So it is about acknowledging that that young person is angry or that young person is upset. Acknowledging that what they're feeling is okay, yeah? And when you do that, it validates the feeling and they can begin to process it a lot easier. So de-escalation scripts, you've probably heard about them a lot before. So you begin by acknowledging that the child or young person, you acknowledge the child or the young person's feelings. That shows that they've been listened to, and it's a crucial step in diffusing a situation. So you could say to that young person, I can see you're upset, or I know this situation has made you angry, or this situation has made you upset. And then you can go into phrases such as, I wonder if we could do this, or I wonder if we could talk about it. Let's try, you know, a sensory circle, or let's try your fiddle toys. Let's try running around. Another acknowledging phrase is, it seems like, maybe we can. So you would typically use a de-escalation script at the beginning. So if you could see a child is starting to become heightened, so we're going back to those signs, clenched fist, yelling, swearing, stomping, expressionless, becoming withdrawn. I would say that those phrases there are too much for a child who is getting towards the top of their anger mountain, towards the top of their peak, to comprehend and process. Some other things to think of. Tell the child what you would rather do than what you don't want them to do. So we are all sticklers for saying to a child, don't do that, don't do this. Yeah, so don't stand on your chair, don't throw that. Tell them what you would like them to do. Because if you tell them not to do something, they still have no idea what you would like them to do. If you tell them what you'd like them to do, it's a very clear, very simple instruction that they can, you know, adhere to. So the example I've got here is obviously from a classroom, or it's not obviously, so it could be at home, sorry. But I want you to sit down, yeah, rather than stop arguing with me. So if you say stop arguing with me, they don't know what to do. So you're only going to begin that de-escalation again. Whereas if you would say, I want you to sit down, or I would like you to sit down, they know what they've got to do. They know how to go past the situation. Give the child time to take up following any direction and avoid backing into a corner, either verbally or physically. So one we get a lot is empty threats. I'm not going to be an angel. I use empty threats a lot. Like, you keep doing that, I'm going to take away your Xbox for a week, or I'm going to take away your Xbox for a month, knowing full well that within half an hour, I'm going to give it back to him, give it back to Liam. So it's about, you know, putting things into perspective. What can you do? What can you realistically do? Another one for this is give the child time to take up. So I always work on a 10-second rule. So if I give a child with or without autism an instruction or a question, I will leave 10 seconds between what I've asked them to asking them again. During that 10 seconds, you've given the brain time to process information and then follow through on an instruction or a command. A command sounds quite bad, so we'll go with instruction. Follow through on an instruction. If you say to a child, right, you need to get up the table now because it's tea, and they don't answer you, and then you say it again, you're like, you know, it's tea time, get up the table. They don't answer you, so you keep going. What you're effectively doing is give them a command, giving them an issue, and then resetting the whole process. So they've not got one command, or they've not got one instruction to follow, they've now got two. And the more you go at a child, the more they're going to escalate, and the more you're going to escalate because you're becoming frustrated. So I always go with the 10-second rule between asking a question or an instruction to repeating it. So here we have a typical de-escalation script. There's loads available on the internet. What I will just say is that all of these are going to be available for 14 days after the event. I'm going to upload all the talks, upload all the presentations. So as from tomorrow, hopefully I'll get it done this evening, but from tomorrow, you can come on, view all the videos again, all 9 talks we've had today, and then there will also be links to download their presentations, download any documents. So from tomorrow, you should be able to access all of them. So I've realised I've only got 10 minutes left. I haven't realised I'm talking that long. So I will leave you in your own time to have a look through that a bit further. So I've told you things to do, but let's look at some things to avoid, shall we? So don't make threats you cannot carry out, such as threatening to exclude the child. So that goes with school. Often in schools, we will hear, you know, that child isn't behaving, so we're going to exclude them. We're going to suspend them. We're going to expel them. Schools have very strict rules and very strict guidance around when they can exclude and when they can suspend a child and when they can indeed, you know, take any kind of isolation action against a child. So that's an empty threat that happens quite a bit in schools. And at home, they happen all the time. And as I said before, I use them. Try not to take it personally and don't become defensive. What is being said or what is being done may look like it's insulting and directed at you, but it is never about you. Yeah, if you're trying to deal with a situation, it's never about you. It's that young person struggling to communicate, and that's what the frustration is. Do not use humour unless you're sure it will help the child and have a good relationship. So in that example I spoke about, the teacher in the socks, he knew that his student responded well to humour. Yeah, so he used it to de-escalate a situation. If you use humour against a child that doesn't understand it, they may feel like you're patronising them, you're making a joke out of the situation, or you're undermining the whole situation, how they're feeling. So I would try not to use humour unless you're absolutely sure it's going to work, which leads into that second one. So don't use sarcasm, don't humiliate the child. There's nothing worse than humiliating a child. I've seen it countless times when I've gone into schools, and it's not a nice thing, not a nice thing to see. But it's also important to remember that sometimes, no matter how carefully and skillfully we try to de-escalate a situation, it will still reach a crisis point. Yeah, no matter how many visual use, how much de-escalation you put in, there will be times you won't be able to deal with a situation. And that is just how the autism brain works. It's how it vents, it's how it releases its frustrations, and how it communicates its needs. So when they are at that peak, all you need to do is be scared. Yeah, not actually scared, but remember, be scared. So be safe, make sure you're safe, make sure that young person is safe. It could be that you need to remove them from a certain environment or remove things from an environment. Typically, you can put a young person outside if you have that space. Being outside is great because it lets them run off a lot of energy, it lets them run around. C is remain calm. Yeah, going back to that de-escalation. If you remain calm, that behaviour portrays across or transfers across. Affirmation is all about affirming how that young person feels. So going back to what we spoke earlier, talking to that young person, saying, I can see you're angry and I can see you're upset and I'm here to help. I'm not sure if I mentioned it, but meltdowns typically take between 12 to 18 minutes to fully resolve themselves before they go into that self-de-escalation phase. Routine. If your young person has a routine and if they thrive on routine, try and get back into it as much as possible. Because with routine, you are lessening anxiety, you're lessening stress. So if you can get back into that routine, you're knocking anxiety and you're knocking the unknown on the head straight away. Empathize with that young person. You know, think about how they must be feeling. If you were that frustrated, if you were that upset and you couldn't communicate to someone how you're feeling, it's called looking through the autism lens. And then develop an intervention plan. So it sounds quite clinical, that does, but it's about looking at the situation, what happened, and how you can, stop it developing further into the future. So it could be that a young person is unable to communicate. Could you give them another way of communicating when they're angry? Could you offer a traffic light system, for example? So when they're beginning to get frustrated, they could show you an orange card. And when they show you the orange card, you know that you need to remove them from the situation or you need to start de-escalating. If they are at their peak, they could show you a red card. And that means you need to put whatever plan you have in place to manage outbursts, emotional states, meltdowns into place. But also give them a green card. So you can ask them how they're feeling. They show you a green card, which means they're quite happy. They're quite secure in where they are. But the best thing to do is reduce the need for de-escalation altogether. A lot easier said than done. I do acknowledge that. How we do that is we reduce anxiety. So you put things like visual timetables in, now and next boards, remove environmental factors. If a child's particularly sensitive to an area, has got a high sensitivity, try and remove that from the area. And on the other side, increase that young person's communication. So if they struggle to communicate, how can you help them communicate further? Do you need to start looking at putting some kind of visuals in? Do you need to, oh, actually, that's on my next slide. So use things like visual timetables. That could be now and next boards, it could be days, it could be weeks, all depends on the young person. Social stories invented by Dr. Gray. I'll get shot if I can't remember her name. I think it's Dr. Gray. But social stories are all about explaining the situation before it happens and the behaviour or the response that's expected. Easy read worksheets and instructions, especially in schools. We get a lot of behaviour when a child doesn't understand what they have to do. So if you provide it in an easy read and easy instructions and follow up and make sure they know what they've got to do, it's a lot easier. Traffic light system that we talked about. Flashcards, simple visuals. They could be pictures, they could be cartoons, they could be words, they could be actual objects to use. And then breakout rooms or exit cards. So when Liam was in high school, he had an exit card. So when he could feel himself becoming frustrated or annoyed in class, he could show his exit card and leave the room for 5 minutes. Now, I've said that to a lot of teachers. Oh, you know, but they'll abuse it. They'll leave the class. They'll do this, they'll do that. If you set very simple, strict instructions alongside those exit cards, they work very, very well. And then obviously we talked to Liam about it as well, and he had Senko support from school around those exit cards. And it got to the point where he was using it for Carol Gray. Thank you very much, Julie. Carol Gray came up with the social stories. I just realised I was going to say Jean Grey, and that's an X-Man, isn't it? That's part of the X-Men. But exit cards, yeah. So Liam started using them quite regularly when he started at high school. And as he got towards year 10, year 11, I think the whole of year 11, he possibly used it once or twice. But then again, he was only in year 11 for half the year. So that's the end of my very quick run through of de-escalation. I didn't realise how fast 45 minutes would go, so I do apologise if we've flown through it. Has anyone got any further questions on what we've covered? Feel free to pop them in the chat if needs be. Or I'm quite happy to take verbal if you would prefer to say it over chat. No? Great. So I'm going to take silence as a good sign. I normally do. So that wraps up our speakers for the day. I hope you've managed to get a lot out of it, and I hope this has... sorry, I've lost my words. I hope the whole format of this has been good for you, and I hope it's something you've enjoyed. Like I say, if you come back tomorrow, or even possibly Friday, give me a day, please. Everything will be uploaded, so if you didn't manage to get to a talk, you can jump to another, you can view that again. If you want to download any of the presentations or any of the PowerPoints, they should be available on that page as well. The whole page will be open, the whole platform will be open for 14 days. So you just need to use that initial link you were given to jump back in. But I understand it's 3:45. A lot of us are parents. Our children will be coming home soon, or we're having to do school runs. So I won't be rabbiting on for too much longer. But just once again, I'd like to thank everyone for coming along, for making today such a great success. I hope you got out of it, and I will speak to you all very, very soon. So goodbye and have a good evening.